Hello and welcome back to the CQC video training series. In this video, we're going to pick back up on the ZWave driver where we left off. And if you remember in the last video, we talked about wall powered units. And these are units that are powered by a socket. So they have all the juice they need to continuously listen for anything to talk to them. So they're the most convenient because they're always available to be talked to. And there are two other types, and we'll quickly cover those. There are frequent listening and non-listening, and both of those are battery powered. The non-listening are what you would expect of a battery powered unit. It can't afford to constantly listen, so it just basically stays off all the time. It will wake up when it needs to send something. So for instance, if it's a motion sensor and you trigger the sensor, it will wake up just long enough to send out the notification that that motion has begun or ended. And other than that, all it does was very once in a while, and often it's hours in between, it will wake up and say, I'm here. If you want to talk to me, this is the time. And so that's called a wake up, which is our next point down, and we'll come back to that. And in between those two types, there is a frequent listening type of unit. And currently, these are just locks as far as I know. I'm not aware of any others that are frequent listeners. They are battery powered, but what they do is they rapidly, say twice a second, wake up, listen for a very short period of time, then go right back to sleep. And their hardware is designed such that they can do this with minimal power usage. So they don't use up a lot of power, but they are there to talk to. However, because they only wake up, say, a couple times a second, that means that the sending unit that wants to talk to it first has to send it a signal to wake it up, which is usually referred to as a beam. And you might hear these as beaming type units. And that beam has to be kept going for at least half a second, some obviously a little bit more just to be sure, in order to ensure that the target unit has time to wake up and see it. So that means that they are considerably slower to talk to than regular units. So it's not a free lunch. And as I mentioned before, when the non-listening type units, they can be talked to, but only for very specific periods of time when they send out a wake up. And the wake up is not the same as sending out, I was turned on, I was turned off, motion was triggered. That's nothing to do with the wake up. The wake up is a separate thing that it does on a schedule. And sometimes that schedule can be set. Usually it can, sometimes not. And at that scheduled time, the unit will wake up and will say, here I am, talk to me if you need to. Now, the got you there is that the wake up is usually only sent to nodes that it is associated with. And we talked about associations a little bit in the previous video. And if you want to learn more, just look into ZWave in general. It's not something that we're going to cover in detail here. But it means that a particular unit has been told, notify this other unit when this or that happens. And typically, wake-ups are only sent, or sometimes at least, wake-ups are only sent to associated units. Sometimes they may be broadcast so that all other units can see them. But if for those that don't send out a broadcast, that means that until you get your controller, in this case our driver, associated with that node, it will never know that it woke up. So it will never know that it can talk to it. So it's kind of a catch-22 that happens, that we can't set it up to be associated with us because that requires sending it messages, but we can't send it messages until we know it woke up, but we can't know it woke up unless we're associated with it. So it's kind of a circular problem. One way around this is that most units will send out a node information frame if you open them up and take out the battery and put it back in. In some cases, they will do it if you press a button inside them. You have to look at the information about that particular unit. But taking out the batteries and putting them back in almost always does, because what that node information frame is saying is, I'm now alive, everybody. I'm back in business again. And so in order for that to work, it really has to sort of broadcast that out and not just send it to associated other units. So that is another way that we can kind of get around the catch-22, is that we will treat that node information frame as though it were a wake up. And we will see that in use as we get into how you get battery-powered units into the driver. And just as one kind of follow-up to those points is that some units are a little smarter than others. Some will be nice, and they will provide a button that perhaps you can press it, and for some limited amount of time, it will wake up and stay awake. And also, in many cases, when you take out the batteries and put them back in, they'll stay awake for some small amount of time at least. Sometimes it might be a minute, sometimes it might be 10 minutes. So it just depends. There's no standard for this. But it does mean that when that happens, we can, for a short period of time, treat it like it's a listening unit and just talk to it, as fast as we want to. So that's usually what happens, is that we get it woken up, and either it sends us a note information frame and we treat that as a wake up because we know that it's just now coming up and that it's at least going to be available to talk to for a short period of time, and we talk to it right at that point. And then later on, once we've done that, that lets us get our association set up. But we try to do everything as much as we can at that first initial node information frame, because otherwise that means you have to go either wake it up yourself, it might be across the house, or you have to wait for it to wake up, which might be hours, which means that it won't really work until that wake up happens and we get a chance to send the setup information that we need to get it prepared to work with our driver. So with all that covered there, hopefully that made sense. If not, go back and listen to it again. And let's move on, and we'll play around with a couple of battery powered units here. So I've gone ahead here and added a lock to our master controller. I didn't do that on the video since it's nothing different from what we've already done. I'm going to use include and then do the appropriate thing according to the documentation on the lock. And you can see there's a little lock beside the lock, which means, as it is over here on our driver, which means that it is included securely. And that's important for locks, obviously. So let's get that over into the driver, and we do that as before. Just hit include, and let's go to our driver and do the include process. Okay. And now we see that there is a new guy here, and you see that it went straight to wait and prove. So it happened just as it did with the wall power one, because we can talk to it, and it identified it as a Yale YRD210 lock. So let's go ahead and approve that. And you'll see now that it's ready. So let's go ahead and name this guy. Let's call it lock. And if we go to the, oops, let's save that. Now let's go over to the driver, which is reloading, and we see that there should be a lock there and a battery state. And it has gotten the lock state, and it's working on getting the battery state. It hasn't gotten it yet. These things can take a little bit longer with these types of units, particularly because they're a little iffy sometimes about sending them multiple things in quick succession. Sometimes they don't respond, so the driver has to retry again. So it should pick that battery level up here in a minute, and there it does. So it's at 86%. And we can, of course, because it is just a regular old type of unit, we can communicate with it without anything special, but it is a little slow. You may not hear it here, but I'll do an unlock. And there it completed. And you can see that it takes a little bit of time, whereas something that's wall powered would just instantly occur. But it does work, and it's always there. And we could go over here and do something like get unit information, and that'll work as it normally would as well. It would be a little bit slower, but it's all there. All right. So for all intents and purposes, other than being a little bit slow, it's just like a regular wall powered unit. So nothing particularly interesting there. So let's go ahead and move on to the non-listening types. Okay, now I have added a multi-sensor and a tilt sensor to the master, and these are both battery powered. And currently they've just been added to the master, and I need to bring them over into the driver, and neither of them are awake in any way. So let's see what happens there. This is usually what is going to happen. In some cases, some devices, once you add them, they'll stay awake for a few minutes. So in those cases, if you quickly add them and then you bring them over to the driver, then they may just automatically get picked up. But in this case, I'm going to do the more normal scenario where they're both back asleep now. So let's bring those over. Okay, so now you can see that they are both in get info state. It'll try to get information when it comes up, just on the off chance that they might happen to be awake. In some cases, like I said, they are, so it'll give it a shot. But if that doesn't work, then you see them both, they both just went to wake up. So basically they're saying, we're waiting for this guy to talk to us. We don't know. We can't speak to it. So we're just waiting. So let's actually give these some names here. So this one is going to be the tilt here. Oh, actually, we can't name it until we get it, until we get the information. So let's do that first. So for this one, which is the multi-sensor, it has a button that I can press, and that button will actually, you can either just, one press is used to just do the regular sort of include me into the master, but if I hit it 3 times, it'll wake up. And now that it is awake, you see that it picked up, right? And since it was awake, the driver did all the setup and everything. So now I'm gonna click it 3 times again to turn it back off. Because if you leave it on, it'll stay on for 10 minutes and that will just chew the battery up horribly in these things. All right, so now for the tilt, we need to pop the top off. And we need to take the battery out and then put it back in. And then once I stick the top back on, or the lid back on, there we go. So it's it has seen that, and now it's ready. Sorry, that was probably very loud. And so those are both ready now, and that's generally what you need to do. So if you happen to get lucky and the thing is already on because it stayed on for a while after being added to the master, then you might pick it up. Or if you know that it has a wake me up mode, you can go ahead and do it. I could have pressed the button 3 times on the multi-sensor before I even brought it over to the driver, and it would have seen it when it tried that first. Might as well give it a shot, attempt to talk to the device. So in that case, it would have picked it up in one shot as well. So it's going to be one of those sorts of scenarios. Either it's going to be awake because you just added it or because you forced it awake and the driver will see it, or once it gets it over to the driver, it's going to go into wake up, and then you can open it up and make it send out a node information frame in order for the driver to see it. So we can now approve those. And let's actually name them so that they're useful over there. So I'll call this one tilt. And this one msense. So now let's save those changes. And if we go over to the driver, which is reloading, and now we see our tilt down here, and you can see now that it's attempting to get status again for these things. So it's got the lock. It should pick up the battery because, as we discovered before, it can talk to the lock. It just takes it a little bit of time sometimes. And for the multi-sensor, there's nothing we can do for that except for just to wait. Well, we can trigger motion. So on this one here, if I trigger the motion sensor, we should see that show up. Although sometimes it's a little, yeah, there it went. So we see that it started motion there. For the tilt sensor, which is down here, for the state, we can tilt it, and that should show up. And there we go. But the other stuff, these are just sensors, and there's nothing we can query from them. We just have to wait for them to be sent. And depending on what the wake up period is, or the reporting period is, which is a configurable thing, it can take a little while to do that. And we won't sit around and wait for that, of course. And the same for the battery here. This will wake up at some point here and send out the battery level for this guy. Sometimes you can query the battery, and sometimes you can't. If we can, we do, but otherwise we just have to wait for it to be reported. So there we go. That's the basic scenario for battery-powered units. Although it looked fairly easy here, it can be semi-annoying. It was a lot easier here because I have them sitting on the desk beside me. Obviously, when they're off somewhere else on the other side of the house, it can be a little bit worse. Of course, you could have the admin interface running on a laptop along with the master controller, and you could do all this there at each individual unit, which might make it easier as well. So that's it. Hopefully this has kind of gotten you oriented, and you can now go read the written documentation on the driver, which should make hopefully a lot more sense now, and it will get more into the details. So we'll see you soon.